This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Eric Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not.
So, today we are going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is TypeScript.
I really like TypeScript too, and this will be an interesting episode. There's a lot to TypeScript. I think in the last, I want to say in the last year, maybe even year or two, it's just blown up in popularity. It still hasn't hit the popularity in the React community, but I keep on hearing more and more people talk about it. For example, I was just listening to a podcast with Wes Boss, and he was saying how they don't use, this was like, I don't know, 8 months ago, how they don't use TypeScript. They don't really talk about it. TypeScript's also one of those things that at first it was kind of like culty, like, trendy a little bit, and they're like, we don't use it. And I swear, the last episode I heard Wes Boss saying, oh yeah, I wrote my whole back end in TypeScript now. So I feel like it's starting to catch on more than just the Angular community. It was the community that really embraced it at first because it's built into Angular 2+. But now I feel like the React community in the last year or two is starting to really pick up on it too.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I kind of feel like it's done a 360 in that fashion as well. And I think part of that has been there's so much change in the front end that anything that you can blow off, you should. And naturally, it starts, once it starts in the front end, and this something can work in the back end and so on and so forth. But I think it takes a little bit of, you have to deal with the issues that TypeScript are trying to solve. And then you're like, dude, I can't take this anymore. There's got to be a better way. And then you go and try it and you're like, oh, hey, this isn't as much of a pain as I think it's going to be. And I've heard a couple complaints from people who aren't super familiar with TypeScript, just thinking it's going to be the biggest pain. And then once they actually dive into it, they're like, dude, I love this.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's the exact same thing that Wes Boss, Scott Talinsky were saying in their podcast. Like, they thought it would be a huge pain to move over to TypeScript, and it's really not. It takes a little bit of a learning curve at the start just to understand how to create interfaces and types, and we'll get into that. But once you get going, you'll be like, where has this been all my life? The hardest thing, and I just want to mention this real quickly, is, have you ever dealt with like a library you downloaded and you need to access it somehow, and then you're digging through the documentation and you're like, okay, is it .this, is it .that? And then the first time you use TypeScript and you're like, use the Intellisense in your whatever editor you're using, you're like, oh my, that is so much nicer. Now I can just hit dot and I see all the methods and functions I can use, and I can just hit enter. And now I know it gives me the function definition that I need to enter in. It just makes me happy.
Yeah, and it's really just been one of those items that I've fallen in love with since day one. But have you, sort of on that same side of TypeScript, it's not the only statically typed sort of superset. There's also Flow. I have no experience with Flow. Have you played around with it or know anything about it?
No, I haven't used Flow at all. I know I think it's created by Facebook, right? And I don't think it's ever gained as much popularity as TypeScript. It certainly hasn't, and I think it's more of an alternative to TypeScript right now. But it has the same statically typed stuff.
Yeah, and I believe TypeScript is created and maintained by Microsoft, right? So
yep,
you have it's funny how we now have these tech companies sort of creating competing dev dependencies, like not even like products that they're trying to sell, but dev dependencies. And I don't think necessarily this is a space in which something's going to take over. Like, the idea of having types isn't something that can really be improved upon too much. It's like we have frameworks, right? But really there's like 3 frameworks. I kind of feel the same way about like these statically typed supersets, where there's not going to be 20 of them, right? There's just going to be 1, 2, maybe 3, and one's going to sort of dominate until something comes along and like kicks it out. And TypeScript, I think, is one of the things that it does what it's supposed to do. Similar like NPM and Yarn, right? It's like it's a tool that does what it needs to do. And so there's not really an edge case where there's going to be something that explodes to overtake it.
I agree. Speaking of which, are you Team Yarn or Team NPM now?
So I used Yarn for a little while, and it's funny because in the boot camp my girlfriend's in, they use Yarn. I just use npm nowadays because when I started to use Yarn, it had to do with the caching of node modules, but npm added that, and I don't really know a reason to use Yarn over npm. And so the idea of like, oh hey, I just have to install this other dependency, even if it's globally, I just don't see the point of it. If npm comes standard, I don't have to worry about it. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about it to be like, yeah, Yarn's going to convince me. And that's sort of the same thing with like any of these things. Is like you have to a degree showcase that something's better than what I'm currently using. I mean, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm the same thing. I tried Yarn for a little bit, went back to NPM. I do see some of just some of the advantages at the beginning with the caching, and it seemed like that may have been rolled back into to Node, the Node package manager. I know recently I was just working on a project. Oh, Vue. I was compiling the latest version of Vue Next, and all the getting started guide was all using Yarn. And I know I could convert it over to npm, but I'm like, okay, I'll just use Yarn. So I had to get Yarn up and running on my box just so I could do this to get to test out Vue Next. Which, by the way, speaking of TypeScript and Vue, just anecdotally, I do a lot of Vue tutorials on my YouTube channel, and I've seen a lot more people interested in me doing tutorials on TypeScript and Vue, and especially with Vue 3 that's coming out very shortly, and how that's going to handle it all. So yeah, even in the Vue community, TypeScript support and TypeScript, people talking about TypeScript is a lot more active. And really, right now with Vue 2, TypeScript support is okay. The biggest issue is if this keyword that we use a lot in Vue isn't being inferred correctly. So you have to do these weird like class-based Vue apps, which is quite a bit different. Not to get on a tangent, but it just to make the point that even in Vue, it's it's being talked about a lot more.
Yeah, to the earlier point about things people sort of not liking TypeScript at first glance is, I think if you go just 5 years back, the majority of developers did not like items that were opinionated. So you take a look at like something like Angular, you take a look at something like TypeScript. These are very opinionated things. It's like this is how you do this, and this is how you do it right. And I think part of the reason that sort of people are coming around to TypeScript is it sort of forces your hand a little bit, and because of that sort of very strong opinion, that it helps. One, I think it helps you become a better developer, but two, it helps set you in the right direction instead of assuming that you know what direction to go into. And so I think a lot of people have been running in wrong directions a little bit with some of their apps and suffered. And the idea of adding TypeScript to it, which is relatively painless to take a JavaScript app and make it a TypeScript app, is something that's starting to appeal to people more and more.
Yeah. Let's get into that. So, can you? We've kind of been talking about it for 8 minutes. I think most people listening right now knows what TypeScript is, but could you give like a rundown on what it is and your experience with it?
Yeah, so TypeScript is what would be referred to as a superset of JavaScript. And so, superset, I've honestly never used the word superset except when talking about like TypeScript. So, it's essentially, it does everything JavaScript does and then some. And that then some is essentially a statically typed language. So, JavaScript is a language that is considered dynamically typed, which means that we can change our types sort of willy nilly. In most other programming languages, you wouldn't be able to change a string to a number and reassign that value without explicitly saying such things. JavaScript allows us to do some wonky stuff, and one of the main criticisms of JavaScript is stuff like, double equals versus triple equals, and be able to just compare values instead of types and values. And TypeScript will still let you do that. Obviously, your linter will go against that, but TypeScript allows us to create a lot of different constructs for readability purposes and for our type purposes, so we know where everything stands and what data types that we're dealing with at the end of the day.
I came from a Java background before I got into web development, and so I was doing a lot of more a statically typed programming. So, what kind of I mean by that, to go off of what Dylan was saying, we have static types and dynamic types, and with a statically typed language, your types are checked before runtime, and usually that's a compile process. So, for example, Java, not JavaScript, but Java is compiled down and it's checked at that point, and the types are checked to see if they make sense. And if they don't, usually the compiler throws an error. Now in Java, there's also a virtual machine, a VM, a JVM that actually runs it too, so it sort of gets run at runtime as well. But typically, like C++, C, Java for the most part, you write the code, you put types in like Boolean, int, uh, array, whatever, and then it compiles it and it gets checked. While a dynamically typed language, the type checking is on the fly during execution. So you can write terrible JavaScript, and this is probably one of the many criticisms of JavaScript there that's out there right now, is that you can create pretty terrible JavaScript code. Lots of times JavaScript will just throw silent errors. They won't even tell you if there's a problem. And then you won't know until it's running in the web page that if there's a problem or not. So that happens. And now there is things, I don't know if you've used this, Dylan, but back in the day, everybody's like, when you write JavaScript code, make sure you use the keyword strict. Use strict. And it was like a way for beginners who are learning JavaScript to get more error catching. So when you use strict in your JavaScript, it throws errors when you're doing some like crazy things. Like if you do assignments that don't make sense, or using global variables, it would throw errors. Have you ever used strict?
Yeah, I have. I would say that sort of became popular in like 2016, 2015, if I remember correctly. And nowadays, I think it's most browsers are, whether you have that in there or not, would essentially have it when it gets compiled. We'll say, hey, just have that. But generally speaking, it's anything that, and that's sort of what TypeScript's about, is being stricter and being a little less fluid at times, where code can be too fluid and it causes issues. And we start breaking principles like the single responsibility principle is probably the one I see people break the most in code. And TypeScript generally will help you simplify some things.
Yep. Another thought about TypeScript that I just came to mind is that one of the really powerful things about TypeScript is that essentially your code, when you're writing it, you get Intellisense, which means that as you're writing, you can see you can see errors, you can see what's available for you, what methods and things are available for you, and it also kind of has good practice where if you set types on everything, then anytime you deal with something being passed into a method, or anytime you're dealing with values, you kind of know what they are. And if you try to do assignments that don't make sense, you'll get errors from the TypeScript compiler. And it just makes you write cleaner code. In fact, I've been in organizations where, since we've used TypeScript, they've used that as a justification to not do as many unit tests, because we know that if we are using typed systems, that some of the basic errors and bugs that we would find if we're doing some really silly things in JavaScript will be caught by TypeScript.
Yeah, and
And I know you don't agree with that. I know you don't agree with that, but you must admit that it does make you less bugs.
yeah, and I think people generally, I mean, I to the sort of the second point, I do think, if you look at a couple stats, and I don't have any offhand, but every book I've read is like, hey, if you add statically typed versus dynamically typed, it'll show you that less bugs make it out to production because you're not having these coercion errors. And JavaScript's really forgiving, so it's like, oh, sure, you're adding a number and an object, cool, we'll figure that out, and it'll just put something out, right? So you'll avoid that. But I do think it's a dangerous game to be like, oh, hey, we don't need to write any tests for our code because TypeScript. When that's not really the use case it's trying to address, although it is going to help. Which is sort of the opposite of what I think one of the main benefits of TypeScript is I think it by using it, it's going to expose you to a lot of concepts and a lot of ideas that aren't included in JavaScript, but are included in other languages, and will expose you to a lot. And I think sometimes developers get too keen on thinking like, oh, they're only ever going to work in one language. It's a very naive thing where, yeah, you may start your career off in JavaScript, but you could be a C# dev 4 years from now, or Java dev, or PHP. Let's hope not PHP, but something something else. And TypeScript forces you to see some of these additional concepts that just don't even exist in the JavaScript language.
Yeah, I think you're going to dive into one, but I know one that I enjoy is classes and kind of this object oriented programming way of thinking when you write your programs. This is really what we do in Java and C# you had mentioned. So that kind of way of thinking. Now you can do this in ES6 and the newer flavors of the JavaScript ECMAScript standard. But I think the negative part is still TypeScript offers more things that we don't get in the newest versions of JavaScript. Like we don't have decorators yet, and you can do those in TypeScript. I don't believe you can do generics. That's in TypeScript as well. So there's definitely a lot more things you can do. And also, some people have commented that the ES6 class specification is just syntactic sugar over the prototypical inheritance that normal JavaScript offers.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. But you can really say that about anything. You could say, JavaScript is just some syntactic sugar for the bits and bytes of zeros and ones that is happening in the background, right? But the reason that exists is to be more readable, to be more consistent with maybe some other higher level languages. And like, I can tell you it works from my experience as being a developer, but also when I was prepping April for her boot camp, she didn't understand. I did both examples. I said, hey, this is how you would do it with prototypes and just storing in variables and blah blah blah, right? And then here's how you would do it with class. She's like, well, I understand the right one. Are you saying the first one's the same thing? I was like, yeah. But it's definitely much easier to read. But that's more ES6 stuff. Some of the stuff that I think is pretty cool, you had mentioned object-oriented programming. I think TypeScript lends itself very nicely to that. But it introduces you and makes it easier to do things like polymorphism, and it makes encapsulation and some of the items that JavaScript really just can't do, period.
Yeah, it's really nice. You can definitely start extending. You can create abstract classes. And to Dylan's point earlier, if you're looking to be full stack and you're looking to do C# or Java, which I think are probably the two biggest ones in the back end that use OOP, object-oriented programming, then learning TypeScript, learning how classes work, learning how interfaces work will really lend itself to your future career as a back-end developer. There is differences, I'll tell you that. Coming from Java to TypeScript, lots of differences, especially the way you think, but there's a lot of similarities too.
Yeah, and obviously it's not going to be perfect, but I know from the majority of developers I've worked with that have transitioned from Java to JavaScript, they have a significantly easier time going from Java to TypeScript than to, because it's instead of going from a statically to dynamic language, you're going static to static, and some things are going to relate that other things may not. So it's, anything you can do to sort of keep that learning curve down always helps.
It's interesting you mentioned that it was easier to teach April the class syntax because I think it's easier, but I know the React community a year ago, rejected the class-based way of creating React apps, and they have totally and completely moved over to the hook-based system. And for Vue, we when they were Evan Yu, the creator of Vue, was creating Vue 3, there was a proposal to use a class-based system, and he rejected it and decided to do more of like a hooks based system as well, sort of like hooks, although it's still completely backwards compatible to Vue 2. So I think the JavaScript community is still uh, divided on this issue of classes. So I think obviously the Angular team and the Angular world has decided classes are the way to go, but I think that there's still a lot of fighting of what's the best way to do it. And I also think in the Vue 2 community, I think they were going to implement it using the ES6 classes, and it doesn't offer enough. Like ES6 is not implemented well enough right now for what they wanted to do. So you would have to have more libraries to do decorators and things like that, and they decided against it.
Yeah, everyone wants to have an opinion. It's a great thing. Some are right, some are wrong. Like it's. But let's talk about some of the features that TypeScript offers. So, are some of the items that you may not know exist if all you've ever worked in is JavaScript, right? So we had briefly mentioned access modifiers and encapsulation, or I guess we mentioned encapsulation slash access modifiers. And one of the great things about TypeScript is it helps you clearly define scope of things. One of the reasons you don't use globals, for instance, is it can be corrupted in such a large scope, right? Anywhere in the app, it can get corrupted. And so by adding some encapsulation to limit where some of our code can be called from, it helps to lower the potential impact. So generally when we're talking about encapsulation, we're talking about public, which anything can call it, private, which only the class of which you're in can invoke said function or property. And then you have protected, which is a little bit weird and it's hard to understand for some people who are not familiar with it. But essentially, the parent class can call it within itself, but you can't call the instantiation from it. But if a child has the same method that extends off of it, that child can then call itself, and other people can call it from that child.
Yeah, that's I'm sad to say this, but when I first jumped into Angular and I was learning it, and I created my first few Angular apps, we didn't use any encapsulation. We didn't use any public private. It was just whatever the default was. We didn't use it at all.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because that's one thing that I think where TypeScript failed. So if you take a language like C# and you don't actually define a access modifier, it's private by default. Uh, TypeScript does the inverse of that and makes it public by default, which I think is a mistake. I think, I think the reason they did that was to make the barrier of entry a little bit easier for people who are just getting up and going, right? They access modifiers, I don't want to think about it, I'll think about it later sort of thing. That was what they just want people to start using it. Well, I think the better long-term play is to get people to start thinking about it. And you can actually do this in your web applications. I've turned it on in the web apps that I work on so that people have to actually define public instead of just assuming that it's going to be there. Define whatever modifier they're going to be using, because I personally want developers to think about, what is this supposed to be? What is the best use case for this?
I by the way, I think in Java it defaults to protected. If I'm right, if I'm correct, if you don't put an access modifier on there. Um, I know that we did in our work. We set up you can set up linting rules. And by the way, TS-lint used to be the linter that you use for TypeScript, but it's being deprecated, and now ESLint is being taken over by it. But regardless of the fact, you can set up your ESLint rules or TS-lint rules so that it kind of gives you an error on everything. Like you can't compile, like your web page won't even load if any little tiny thing's wrong. And I think you can set that up. Yeah, you can set up like you have to have public or you have to have different modifiers and things. So which I have never done that far, but I do have a higher lint setting like that. A lot more errors show up.
Yeah, I tend to have pretty strict lint settings. I think it's better to be more strict than loose. But I definitely know that some of the developers I worked with find me annoying because I've set that up on the projects. But
It kind
um,
of goes back to our conversation about doing code reviews and code quality. if you can set as much as you can in your linting settings to prevent people from doing stupid things, and it will stop them and they can't either build or they can't compile or submit their pull request without an error, then better off too. Because when it gets to the code review side and then you're nitpicking little things, a lot of developers dislike that, and it's an uphill battle at that point. But if you can make it a built-in rule somewhere where they can't submit it unless they fix it, then they're more likely to fix it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm very big on automation. So like in the web apps I work on, I recently added like a spell check. Like literally you have to spell things right or you can't even submit a PR. So similar to how we can set some of these lint settings and whatnot, if there's anything in your web apps that you can automate, I highly suggest that you do so that it just becomes part of the process. Now, I think you should have a conversation unless you're the tech lead, right? You don't want to just be adding stuff to the web app all willy nilly. And even as a tech lead, you probably want to get some input, but definitely something to consider. All right, so a couple other modifiers or encapsulation that we didn't talk about would be the read-only modifier, which essentially makes something, as you might imagine, read-only, which is really helpful for some of those unique values that there's zero chance you're going to override, such as maybe a primary key for an object, or an array that you don't want to be resetting, but still is public, right? Um, so you can have something public, but is only read only. And then we have the static access modifier as well.
Yeah, I've used read only a few times in some of my apps. I think one of the kind of clean code principles out there is to not use magic numbers. I mean, if you have just a random magic number in your app, then you probably should pull that out into its own property or its own variable somewhere and define it. That way, you just have one place where it's at and one place you can change it. And if it never changes, maybe putting that read only modifier at is a good idea.
Yeah, and also to that point, when we talked about lint settings, that's another thing that you can turn on in your linters, no magic numbers. And the reason you would do something like that is to give it a descriptive variable name, right? You might go and look at something and it might be a zero point 0.1, right? Times zero point 0.1, and you're like, what the hell is this 0.1 represent? It may have made sense when you wrote it, a year ago, but jumping back into to solve a minor bug or something, you're trying to debug what the code what the code means. You can put that in there so that you could say, oh, the zero point 0.1 is actually, let's say it's a monthly interest calculator or whatever it is. You just store that in a const and throw read only on it and call it a day, so that you're lends yourself to that more clean code and readability, which kind of what TypeScript all about. It allows you to look at your code and read exactly what the type is, and sort of see who has access to it, or what rather has access to it.
I've worked in code bases where it's insanely complicated with tons of magic numbers everywhere, and you look at it and you're like, oh my god, I have no idea how did they get 0.725? Like, what does this mean? Like, you have no idea. And of course, probably none of these code bases are ever really well documented either.
Yeah, I think one of the things that unfortunately happens quite a bit is that a lot of projects get started that are supposed to be like one-offs. Like, I don't know how many times I've been told something's going to be a one-off, and then before I know it, I'm working on it for a year. It's like, yeah, it's just a 1 month project. Don't worry about it. So I think it's very important to start figuring out what tools you like and what tools add some strictness to the code base, and start off strong. Like, it's much harder to add these things to an existing code base than to go and say, okay, cool, I'm just gonna go crazy with the linter, with the TypeScript settings, with quality control, and we can always pull them back, but it's going to be tenfold harder to add it later on.
Thinking of this, and you might be covering this in a minute, but the two most ones, the types that I use the most probably are interfaces and classes. What do you, and of course the normal variable declarations where I declare things as strings or objects or booleans. Do you I mean, I think those three things, doing variable declarations, interfaces, classes, and what you've already talked about, access modifiers, are kind of like the low hanging fruit of TypeScript that you start doing right away. And we can jump in what they are too for people that are
Yeah,
listening.
I would say you've left out actually two major ones, and we've talked a bit about interfaces, and we'll dive into that deeper and why I don't like them. But one thing that I like quite a bit are enums. So enums, for people who don't know, essentially there are numbered enums and string enums, and typically I use string enums to store magic strings and provide context. That's really what an enum is. It's an object in which it has keys to provide context for something, right? Your database might have a value of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and each one of those might resemble a payment type, for instance. So you might have a payment type enum in your app, and that could be MasterCard, Visa, American Express, so on and so forth. And then you have context to say, okay, this is what a 0 and 1 and so on and so forth is. And so enums I use all the time to capture that context as well as to make it more readable. If we say is equal to 0, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense and goes back to our whole magic number thing. But if we say payment types dot MasterCard, we have a much cleaner and more readable understanding of what it does.
To play devil's advocate here, why couldn't you just create a variable name called payment types
So
Mastercard camel cased?
So you definitely could, and that's one option. And it's a better option than doing a magic number. But the issue becomes is that oftentimes we are going to be using such items as this payment type Mastercard in multiple locations, and so we want it to exist in a single location to lower the chance of error. And even if it's just a single file, that single file may be used in multiple additional spots, such as like your test file. You should be testing it, and you want to say, okay, cool, let me pass in XYZ payment type, and then test it using this enum as well. And it's sort of it's going to be in a different file, and you may not use it immediately, but typically when you're having these values, everything always grows in scope, and you'll find that you're gonna sort of prevent yourself from shooting yourself in the foot by doing said things. Although the more common scenario that people will say is, why not just create an object that you're importing and exporting? And at the end of the day, enum compiles down to an object and it's a valid thing. But again, it's about providing context and adding some of these structures that are not there. And I think enums and in that sense are fantastic.
Now, this is what you do. You take your variables you want to share throughout the app. You throw those suckers on the window object.
Yeah.
Problem
Man,
solved. Everywhere.
you say that, and everyone's laughing like, oh, that would never happen. It happens, people, and then like, trust me, it happens all the time, and it breaks applications, and it's been the cause of rewrites because it's been so it gets corrupted so hard. But the other item that you didn't mention that I think is worth mentioning is abstract classes. And that is something that you will never even know exists if you've never worked in something other than JavaScript, but it's one of the more powerful items of object-oriented programming and lends itself nicely to polymorphism, lends itself nicely to creating base classes, which I think too often people sort of, how to put this, don't think enough about like, oh, well, yeah, they sort of have some correlation, but I'm not sure how to do it, and I don't want to instantiate that class. Abstract classes are really great for that. I find myself using them more and more frequently, especially as I start integrating things like the dependency inversion principle of the solid principles so that we can make sure that we depend on definitions and not on implementations in our code base.
In my day to day, I had never created an abstract class ever, in at least an Angular app I was working in. But I've had some coworkers have, and I've looked at that code, and I definitely see like they were taking code that was kind of common to all the different classes, and they're putting it all in this abstract class, and they were able to do some neat things. Readability wise, I was always like, a couple of times I was looking at the class like, where did this variable come? And then I had to go and look at the extended and look at the abstract class like, oh, it's from here and this is how they're doing this. But I could definitely see just simplifies things and lends itself to the you know don't repeat yourself dry principle too in some places.
Yeah,
And it works a lot different in Java, I
you
feel like.
you definitely don't want to abuse it, because one of the issues, like, I typically try to use implements versus extends, and to provide context for people who maybe aren't super familiar with that object-oriented programming. When you extend something, you're essentially inheriting the values and methods, and you don't need to re-implement them in your child class. So if I have a user and then I have like an admin user that inherits from user, if I implement that, all the properties, all the methods, I have to then give their own declaration and admin user. And so you can see it there. While if I extend that, I don't have to do anything. It's still going to have access to that. And so abstract classes give you the option of implementing or extending it, but typically you're going to use the abstract class when you want to extend something, um, and not actually instantiate it itself. So you got to be careful, because sometimes you can go down the path of um, making something sort of too magic, where you're like, yo man, why can't it do this? I don't see anything in here that that showcases that.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of confusing. There's definitely a difference between when you're using abstract classes, like Dylan said, between implementing and extending. I think that was a pretty succinct answer to it. In other languages, we use interfaces as more as the um, implementing because you think of it almost like a contract, and so you are kind of implementing that contract inside your class. While in the other hand, when you're extending something, you're like Dylan said, you're just kind of adding to it. So you would say you use implement more
Yes, and that's
or
because
extend more. I was
I
not
know
sure.
I use implement more. Excuse me, yeah, implement. Sorry, I use implement more because I want to actually write out what it's using, and I want classes to see what's happening. Part of the other thing about that is you start seeing if something gets too large relatively quickly, where maybe you're in your third or fourth nested sort of like inheritance, and you start seeing like, wow, this thing has 50 base level properties. Apparently, I'm doing something wrong. Well, if you are extending it, you're like, oh, I'm only adding, this thing has 7. That's still a large amount, but it's not a super large amount. You start seeing like, maybe I need to start rethinking my objects and my models.
Do you use any of the other TypeScript ones? Like I've been trying to learn generics, and I kind of watched a few YouTube videos, but I haven't found a place to use it yet. There's also iterators and generators and symbols, and then you can even create your own namespaces. And I've learned a little bit about decorators, and but I haven't really used it a lot in my day-to-day job.
Yeah, I don't use generics too much. I actually kind of find generics to be somewhat of a anti-pattern to TypeScript, which there's going to be types that are going to be a little bit more fluid. That's just the nature of code, right? Um, so I don't really have a use case. I definitely have used them once or twice, and it's usually been someone wrote something and then I had to do that to make it work. But I have used some of the cooler stuff like partial, which allows you to inject only part of an object, or it only has to relate to some of it. And I like return types or something. I'm very big on as well. I think that's a cooler function of TypeScript that people seem to hate as well, where you can actually say what a function is going to be returning.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. That's interesting. Generics, yeah, generics allow you to almost create types that are inferred that you don't have an exact type to them. So it is a little bit a different way of thinking. Interesting is interesting. I haven't used partials yet either, and that seems like something I should learn.
Yeah, partial's nice where, hey, I don't really care if the whole object comes through, if there's just part of it, pass that in. Omit is another one that I've used recently, where we were essentially creating an npm yup repo. Yup is a schema validation library that makes sure that your database has a certain values, or you're passing certain values to your API calls, and that it's going to validate that. And we used omit to rip out some of the values that we don't want to be called elsewhere, but still need to be part of the original object. So there's a lot of these. God, I'm forgetting the name of like partial. They're not types exactly. They're I'm forgetting what TypeScript calls them, but essentially they're sort of like helper functions almost, where it say, hey, for this types, we're going to treat it slightly differently.
I like that. One other thing I'm thinking of, let's go back to interfaces for a moment. So the way I use interfaces, and this is funny because I think between me and Dylan, we use TypeScript a little differently, and I think there's probably not a right way or wrong way to do it. And as we both level up, we're probably going to be using different functions and different ways to using it. But like in interfaces, the way I've used it is whenever we have like some complicated object that we're return like it's being returned from a server, and we expect it to be in this format, we might slap a interface on that object that we receive back, and now we have access through Intellisense to everything that's in it. And then if we try to access something that we didn't define in the interface, then it usually throws an error at us. And that way we know that that's probably a bug because we didn't define an interface. And you don't have to do this just with objects that are returning back from a server. It could be any sort of data object that you want to capture information in. And so as you grow your apps, you're going to find out that you have lots of pieces of information, and there's different ways of organizing it, and being able to slap an interface onto it, and basically that defines it, then you have a better idea what's in it and how you can access it and what you can do with it. And that's kind of how I use them. And also it's it's a good point to note that what TypeScript does is it looks through everything you've written in your TypeScript file and it compiles it back to JavaScript. And that compile part will see the interfaces, and I believe it just throws all those interfaces out the door after it does the check to make sure that what you did is right. So it gets compiled out. Well, on the other hand, you can, and I think Dylan's going to talk more about this in a second, is you can try to structure the data as classes. And so you're almost creating and instantiating a class which you pass the data into, and then it can be accessed using the object or the class itself.
Yeah, and that's part of why I don't like interfaces is it just kicks that shit out, which is fine, but it doesn't it enforces it at compile time, but not necessarily at like runtime, right? And so like I like using classes, mainly because I like to I think it also helps to future proof where instead of just saying what this type is, we might be able to have helper methods as well. And we can set default values where, hey, this is supposed to be an array. I'll check to see if this value that we pass in is actually an array. And if it's not, I'll set it to be an empty array so that it doesn't blow up the rest of my application and sort of gracefully fails in that edge case. But that's typically why I tend to avoid interfaces and prefer using classes and actually, especially when it's coming from a third-party resource like an API, I think it makes it a little bit safer in the application.
By the way, if you are working with a team lead and they're like Dylan, expect anything that's an object that has data in it, you're going to have to label it as either an interface or class.
Yeah.
And and it's probably good practice, but you'll find out as your apps grow larger and you're dealing with lots of different data types and data that creating those interfaces and classes is in even classes, it just takes a longer amount of time to do things. Well, in the past, you might be used to working JavaScript and just slap something together really quickly. But when you have to go back and add interfaces, then things take a little bit longer. But it should help you in the long term of catching more bugs.
Yeah, and I don't think it's sort of like the same thing with testing. The first thing people complain about is I'm never going to get anything done if I don't do this and that. It's like it actually typically speeds things up once you go and do it. And it's not, I mean, you're only going to be creating one or two models at a time. And it's not going to be something that's going to take you more than 20 to 30 minutes tops to go and say, oh, cool, I created this model that I can now pass this into and it created this type and so on and so forth. Especially one thing I'm really worried about is, and this is a cool feature that other languages have, but in the most recent version of TypeScript, and I believe this is happening in JavaScript as well in the next year or so is the optional chaining or null coalescent operator, which essentially, instead of having to do if object.property, if object.property.property, you can use the question mark like you've been able to do in Angular templates to check that. I'm even more worried about it moving forward because of that people are going to be a little more wishy-washy with their types because they have these things that will fail a little bit more gracefully than they have in the past.
I did hear about that. That's really cool. Is it in the latest version of TypeScript already?
Yeah, when so TypeScript's in version as of recording this 3.7, which is what Angular 9, which came out about 3 days before recording this as well. So it's in that now, and I thought I saw that in the 2020 or 2021 edition of JavaScript it's going to be in there as well, which is probably why they're adding it.
That's really cool. I know one thing that a lot of people do, I do this, is if you're working with something and you don't know if it's instantiated or not, or if it's null or not. So you might have to do these checks in these objects. Well, you might have this, color, or let's say it's a car object, and you have this car.color. You know there's a car.color, but sometimes car.color doesn't exist, or maybe car.color.paint doesn't exist. So you do these if operators where if car and ampersand car.paint and car.color.paint, and if all three of those are true, then you go into to do what you want to do. And I think that's pretty common if you want to just check an object to make sure it structures correctly. And now you could do something like if car question mark dot paint question mark dot blah question mark, and then it won't throw an error if one of those is undefined.
Yeah, a lot of cool stuff. And I just actually did it in the playground, and it generates a whole bunch of JavaScript code for that. So it kind of scares me. But it's a nice feature that I think will stop some additional bugs coming in.
There's another way to check for that. Isn't there like an object is property, like you're just saying, or I can't remember.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways you can check for that, but that's on one level deep, I believe. So, like, if you're going multi-level deep, you then have to write a recursive function to handle that. So,
in a side tangent, and I know we're wrapping up here in a second, but I was looking at Angular 9, trying to upgrade one of my apps to it, and I found that some code out there, some third-party libraries aren't Ivy ready. Have you heard this? Like, they're not Ivy ready yet, and you have to turn off the Ivy compiler for them to work. And then I had one library that just threw an error every time, even with the Ivy compiler off. I'm like, oh my god, this. So upgrading to Angular 9 for the 10 people that are listening that are doing this, not so easy so far for me.
No, I didn't know about that, but I appreciate that because that's something I'm doing next week.
It does reduce the bundle size, though. That's like another reduction of the bundle size, especially for larger apps. They're finding ways of like taking out Angular, and so you don't have to have so much of that runtime. Because in the past, when you created Angular apps, even after you like minified it and did all that, you're still looking like 200K sometimes. And every release they've kind of cut that down.
Yeah. Okay. I don't have anything else to say about TypeScript. Yeah. We good here?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, check it out. TypeScript's the shit. So let's leave it on that.
Yep.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at eric.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members. And you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.